Jaws pretty much set the world on fire when it first hit cinemas back in 1975. It broke every record, became the most successful film of all time, and permanently etched itself into popular culture. I don't need to tell you how big this movie was. Everyone knows the theme, everyone knows the quotes. As the years have gone by, there have been countless references, homages, parodies, and straight-up knockoffs to the point where the iconography is almost separate from the actual film. I don't even want to know how many Zoomers out there think that the song is from fucking Shark Tale, and that's what Jaws is most remembered for. The brilliant cinematography, the iconic score, the one-liners, the shark that looks as plastic as Dolly Parton but is still more believable than most Marvel movies these days. And all those things are great. I want to talk about them too, but I feel like nobody ever really talks about the script. Because Jaws is one of the best movies that I've ever seen. No hyperbole. And so much of that rests on the strength of the writing, particularly the characters. It's a brilliantly told story of three misfits battling a force of nature that they can't contend with. It's a story of horror, adventure, humanity, conflict, and camaraderie, and somehow it strikes the perfect balance of each. It was a mammoth project that nobody could have hoped to accomplish, but somehow, they nailed it. Martin Brody is the newly appointed chief of police on Amity Island, having moved his family in from New York only a few months prior. The film is very quick to establish him as both a caring family man and an outsider to the community, who believes that Amity will be a safe place for his family.
Be careful, will you?
In this town? Hey!
When a mangled body washes up on the beach, he doesn't waste a moment trying to close the beaches to protect the town, pushing aside all of the other mundane issues that he usually has to deal with. The town's mayor is working against him, and after being confronted, he reluctantly backs down and allows the beaches to stay open. But he's still wary. His fear of the water is also established through a few nervous glances and some dialogue with other characters. I particularly like that he's the only one on this beach not wearing swimwear. Clever. When his fears are confirmed and a young boy is taken by the shark, he springs into action again, but he's too late to do anything. Guilt-ridden, he once again tries to close the beaches, but he's overruled once more. When he's confronted by the mother of the child who died on his watch, slapped in the face and blamed for his death, he doesn't try to defend himself or justify his actions. He accepts that because of his inaction, a child is dead.
I'm sorry, Martin. She's wrong.
No, she's not.
He continues to do everything in his power to protect the town within the mayor's sanctions, but it's no use. People keep dying. And finally, his son is traumatized and nearly killed in an attack. This is the last straw. Brody demands the mayor hire someone to kill the shark, and he capitulates. Against his better judgment, Brody faces his fears and joins the hunting party, driven by guilt and resolve to see this through to the end. He's completely out of his depth in this environment, but still does everything in his power to help out his companions and sees his mission through, never giving in to fear. Brody is clearly not the stock standard action hero. He's an everyman, with fears and weaknesses, and even a level of ineptitude when compared with the other two. But it's his deep sense of resolve and responsibility to protect his family and his town that makes him such a fantastic character to watch. He's just a normal guy, doing the best he can in a bad situation.
I'm telling you, the crime rate in New York will kill you. There's so many problems, you never feel like you're accomplishing anything.
But in Amity, one man can make a difference.
In 25 years, there's never been a shooting or a murder in this town.
Long thing. You want a pretzel?
Matt Hooper is a wealthy oceanographer, an Ivy League graduate called in by Chief Brody to investigate the shark attacks on Amity. His maritime experience is immediately apparent in the way he tries to help Brody with the chaos at the harbour. Brody is clearly lost amongst the local fishermen, but Hooper speaks their language. Hooper is clearly distressed at the sight of the first victim's remains, suggesting he's not used to being so close to the aftermath of a shark attack. But still, he carries out a thorough and professional examination. This guy clearly knows his stuff, even if he has a weak stomach. and he's more than happy to dig into the coroner for his boating accident claims. At the sight of the tiger shark, Hooper is immediately skeptical and wants to analyze it further. He's the only one with the knowledge of sharks to know that the evidence just doesn't line up. Well, maybe not the only one. The dinner scene shows a lighter side of Hooper's character. He's clearly light-hearted and eccentric, happy to crack jokes while explaining his love of sharks. He's a great balance for the tightly wound chief. The pair go out in search of the shark, and Hooper is even brave enough to get in the water to look for evidence, but he rightly shits his pants at the sight of a severed head. When Hooper realizes what he's dealing with, he joins Brody in trying to protect the beach, cancelling his other research and going toe-to-toe with the mayor, to no avail. Hooper is constantly at odds with a certain other character I haven't spoken about yet, but that's his character in essence. He's the brains of the team, as well as the comedic relief at times. Like Brody, he wants to do what's best for the town, and like other character, he has a deep fascination with the shark they're hunting. He's a great middle ground.
Don't you tell me my business again. You get back on the
Well,
bridge.
that doesn't prove a damn thing.
Well, it proves one thing, Mr. Hooper. Proves that you wealthy college boys don't have the education enough to admit when you're wrong.
Quint is a Chad. That is all. Introduced in the film by scratching his nails on a chalkboard, a scene that's been aped hundreds of times since, Quint wastes no time asserting his dominance. He's the best in the sharking business, and he knows it. He states his case and sets his price, and bids the townspeople adieu. When they come crawling back in the form of Brody and Hooper, he has no issue increasing his demands. To Quint, everything's a pissing contest. He treats Brody like a child, needing to be coddled. He gives him a shot of moonshine and stares right into his soul, waiting for him to swallow it, which he predictably can't, immediately emasculating him in Quint's eyes. And he practically towers over Hooper, berating him at any possible chance. Despite Quint's gruff nature, he's still just a quirky, jovial sea captain who loves singing sea shanties and cracking jokes, but mostly at the expense of others. He's even somewhat protective of Brody, giving him pointers in basic seamanship and trying to keep him away from the action. When the shark shows up, he's all business, barking orders left and right, but still calm and collected. He's even having fun to begin with. With one barrel stuck into the shark, he's content to wait the night out and stalk his prey. After a few drinks, he shares his retelling of the USS Indianapolis sinking. This monologue is so chilling and captivating. I've seen it about 100 times and I still can't take my eyes off the screen. I had to fucking mute it while I was editing this because I kept pausing to watch it. The fact that Robert Shaw actually had the final pass on writing this monologue makes his performance so much sweeter.
When he comes at you, doesn't seem to be living until he bites you, and those black eyes roll over white, and then... oh, then you hear that terrible high-pitched screaming. The ocean turns red. You know, that was the time I was most frightened, waiting for my turn. I'll never put on a life jacket again.
You were taken too early, you god among men. Not to mention there's a nice little bit of foreshadowing in there for you. This monologue is Quint's whole character distilled. He's a man obsessed, not unlike Hooper, but driven by fear and anger. He's dedicated his life to hunting sharks out of some grim fascination. And the more this particular shark evades him, the clearer this becomes. It's a game of cat and mouse. And he's quickly becoming the mouse. His increasingly risky attempts to kill the shark are slowly tearing his ship apart and dragging him deeper into his obsession. When Brody tries to radio for help, Quint smashes his own radio to make sure nobody can poach his prize. When he pushes too far, effectively sinking his own ship, he turns to Hooper and his gear for help, extending an olive branch with respect, but it's too little too late. Quint's dangerous tactics sealed his fate, and he winds up going toe-to-toe with the shark just like he wanted. And he loses. The interplay between these three characters is what makes this movie so special. The film is extremely efficient at characterizing each of them quickly so that it can throw them all together and watch them go. Brody and Hooper quickly form a natural partnership, utilizing their respective skills to shore up each other's weaknesses, developing a rapport and even respect. Then Quint comes in and shifts the whole dynamic. Suddenly Hooper and Quint are measuring dicks and Brody can't even find a ruler. Quint gives Hooper no credit, asking him to tie a basic knot to test him, and he doesn't even look at it before grabbing his hands, staring into his eyes and basically telling him to fuck right off. There's a constant clash between Hooper's classic education and Quint's years of hard work and experience, and pretty much every line they share echoes this in some way. They share a goal, but with two totally different methods, and it's great fun to watch.
You go inside the cage. Cage goes in the water. You go in the water. Shark's in the water. Our shark. Farewell and adieu to you fair Spanish ladies.
The way that Quint necks a tinny like a true blue Aussie, and Hooper responds by crushing a plastic cup. It's just fucking brilliant. Then, after a hard day's sharking, just like any good blokes would, they share a few drinks, compare scars, and have a sing-along, developing at least a passive respect for each other, which culminates in Quint eventually swallowing his pride and utilizing Hooper's skills and gear, which he had so openly mocked before. Meanwhile, Brody is obviously no challenge to Quint, so he basically takes him under his wing, giving him little tasks to do here and there and patronizing him wherever he can, but he does show a level of genuine concern. For Hooper as well, even. It's not as if he wants either of them to get hurt. Their journey is solidified at the end of the film, with Brody elated and relieved to see that Hooper survived, and the two sharing a quiet moment for the fallen Quint. While we're still talking characters, there is one more minor player that I want to talk about. Mayor Larry Vaughn acts almost as a human antagonist in the first half of the film. He holds the opposite position to Brody, repeatedly trying to minimize the shark attacks in an attempt to keep the beaches open. It's very easy to see him as a sort of villain. After all, I wouldn't call muscling the coroner into changing a cause of death particularly moral. But the great thing about Vaughn is that he's mostly justified within his own logic. He's presumably an Amity native, having been on the island for decades, and he's massively invested in the town's welfare, being the mayor and all. He knows that shark attacks are a rarity, if not non-existent, on Amity Island, and the summer period is critical for the community's survival. After the first attack, he's dismissive of the idea of it being a shark attack at all. After the second, he's forced to acknowledge the shark, but he still minimizes the panic and puts out a bounty. A shark is then caught, which he believes to be the shark, and so all is well, beaches can open. Hooper and Brody say that that isn't so, the shark that they're looking for is still out there, but with no concrete evidence. Unwilling to risk the town's financial security on the hunch of two outsiders, he allows the beaches to flood with swimmers, effectively ringing the dinner bell, and, surprise surprise, the attacks continue. He acted within his character, and these deaths are on his hands. That's true. But guess what? He acknowledges that. The last we see of him, he's a nervous wreck, shaking, muttering, and profusely apologizing to Brody and accepting all the blame. It's a major shift, and all of that is captured in one brilliant line.
Martin, my kids were on that beach too.
He believed in what he was doing. He didn't mean for anyone to get hurt, especially Brody's son. He was so certain that he was acting in the town's best interest, and his mistake cost innocent people their lives. And what's worse? It very well could have been his own children that he was feeding to the meat grinder. And we get to see the full weight of that realization. So yeah, he's a bit of a cunt, but a nuanced and consistent one at least, which is a lot better than you tend to get these days. Now that I've got all the character writing out of my system, I want to talk a little bit about the structure. Peter Benchley's original novel was a bit more convoluted than the film, featuring branching storylines involving the mafia and a romantic subplot between Hooper and Brody's wife. Yes, really. When Spielberg took on the project, he wanted to refine it into a straight A to B adventure story, with the shark as the sole focus. The result is a movie that's divided neatly into two halves, the first half being spent developing the characters and establishing the shark as a serious threat, and the second throws the main trio together on a tense shark hunt. The transition happens pretty seamlessly, and the film is able to keep a constant rising tension, basically because Spielberg doesn't blow his load all at once. Instead, it's like he's edging, slowly building towards the climax. The film introduces the shark slowly through a series of attacks. The shark is completely unseen during the first, represented only by underwater POV shots, letting the audience's imaginations run wild. The second attack repeats the POV shots, but this time we get a glimpse of some fins behind a torrent of blood. The fact that this attack results in the brutal death of a child helps sell just how merciless this creature is. The third incident leaves the shark unseen yet again, but it's instead represented by a chunk of pier that's ripped off, leaving you to question just how strong this thing actually is. We only see the aftermath of the fourth incident, being a badly damaged boat with massive holes torn through the hull, and a huge tooth left behind. With a severed head, of course. And this head supposedly belonged to a very competent and experienced fisherman. By now, we know that we're dealing with a very large, very powerful killing machine that eats indiscriminately, and we haven't even seen the shark yet. The final attack of the first half shows us the shark's dorsal fin, and a quick glance from the surface as it preys, once again hinting that it's a big chungus. Throughout the second half, the shark is mostly represented by floating barrels that Quint uses to force sharks to the surface. The shark is easily able to submerge with one barrel attached, and even two does very little to stop him. Quint's reaction to this escalation gives the audience a great idea that this is no ordinary shark. When Quint eventually gets a third barrel in, it seems like he's done it, but even then the shark is still able to submerge. About 2/3 of the way into the movie, we get our first real look at the shark, with Brody speaking for the audience. And from that point on, we're treated to casual glimpses here and there. During Hooper's cage dive, we see the shark alongside Hooper, and its true scale is terrifying. It easily destroys the cage and capsizes Quint's whole ship before taking him into its mammoth jaws. By this point, the audience has seen everything they need to know about this shark to understand what a force of nature it is. And now it's just Brody alone against it. It's a wonderfully tense final conflict, and it's all been built up throughout the film. In the novel, the shark simply succumbs to its wounds at this point, leaving Brody, the terrified sole survivor, to paddle back to shore having come within an inch of his life. But the film built up this conflict so spectacularly, through the characterization of both Brody and the shark, that it had to go out with a bang. Brody makes a defiant last stand, facing the thing that he fears most, and is able to blow the shark up at the last second in a huge moment of catharsis. And in an added bonus, Hooper even survived. A happy, even serene ending for a brutally tense story. Before I close out, I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about the production. It's no secret that Jaws was a fucking nightmare to film. It's been the subject of a lot of documentaries, and they're a great watch. Between time crunches, tension between the cast and crew, and mechanical shark failures, it's safe to say that nobody really thought that this movie would come through. So it really speaks to the talent and dedication of those involved that this movie landed where it did. And it's apparent that they took the production troubles in their stride, finding innovative ways around them. Because the shark was so unreliable and artificial, Spielberg used it sparingly, opting instead for inspired cinematography that hints at the idea of the shark, giving glimpses of the creature in escalation as the film progresses. He even combed through every single frame of the film with his editor, trying to find the exact point where the shark looked fake to him so that he could cut it out, increasing believability. The result basically became the gold standard for creature feature style horror movies, using the imagination to scare people more than you ever could with some over-the-top creature. And all of this resulted because they couldn't use the shark nearly as much as they wanted to, and they had to get creative. Cinematographer Bill Butler constructed his own DIY waterproof camera housing strapped to a pontoon just so that they could get shark POV shots that felt real. He basically revolutionized underwater cinematography, particularly in horror films, and so many other horror films in the last 50 years owe that to him. Even the conflict between the principal cast, particularly Dreyfuss and Shaw, seeped into their performances, making them more believable at times. This is what happens when you get a group of professionals that are allowed to take risks. When you've got a passionate director with a crew of experts in their fields, mixed with a stellar cast and an airtight script. Not to mention John fucking Williams. When you get a bunch of people who know what they're doing and who give a shit about what they're making, you get a movie so good that it fucking changed movies. Now, do I think Jaws is perfect? Because I've been so positive for so long and I can feel my soul starting to warm up, there are a few criticisms that we could wheel out. Firstly, a pretty minor one, it's heavily implied that a dog was killed in the lead up to Alex Kittner's death. Poor form, Spielberg. Children are fair game, but dogs are off limits. If that is the case, then I find it very convenient that nobody noticed, given the size and power of the shark, especially the dog's owner. But again, it's just implied. It's totally possible that the dog got spooked and just ran off. Well, that's my headcanon anyway. You're free in my dreams, Puppo. During the pier scene, I think it's safe to say that this guy should definitely be dead. That shark is moving way too slow, and the only explanation is that he just wants to fuck with him. It's a great scene, and I like the fact that he makes it. But from what we're shown, it's hard to see him outswimming Bruce, isn't it? Earlier, I gushed a bit over Vaughn, but this one's a bit harder to square away. He doesn't really react to Ben Gardner's death. At all. From what we know, Ben was a well-respected local who went out sharking the same day that the tiger was caught. His death alone is possible evidence that the shark is still out there, and Vaughn doesn't really ask questions about it at all. Or anyone else, for that matter. It's just really weird that nobody cares about this. It is definitely a contrivance that the prank manages to distract all of the authorities at the perfect time for the shark to sneak into the estuary unnoticed. If the Coast Guard wasn't preoccupied, If the Coast Guard wasn't preoccupied, there's a good chance that the shark would have been spotted and killed then and there. Hell, it's really lucky for these kids that the Coast Guard didn't just open fire as soon as they saw the fin. This isn't a plot hole. None of this is impossible. It's just a bit weak that it all happens exactly how it would need to, at exactly the right time for the plot to progress. Where the story could have ended right here if it had gone 5 minutes in either direction. Here's a weird one. Where do the barrels go? Quint is able to stick 3 barrels into the shark, but by the time Hooper cage dives, they're gone. The last we see them, they're being dragged under again. The meta explanation here is that they weren't needed anymore. This is the point of the film where the shark gets more screen time and the barrels are no longer needed to represent it. But what happened? Did the shark take the harpoons out? Did they fall out? It seems inconsequential, but if those barrels were still attached, which they probably should be, the shark would be a lot less maneuverable and stealthy during the final conflict, which could definitely have changed the outcome. And finally, the scuba tank. Yes, I've seen Mythbusters. Yes, I know this wouldn't actually work. And so did Spielberg. But this is why we make the case for internal logic. Earlier in the movie, it's established by Hooper that scuba tanks could explode if messed around with. Even just from them crashing into other objects on the boat, he's worried. While this may not be accurate to real life, the film doesn't contradict this information at any point. It's an explicit setup to establish the logic by which the conclusion can happen. If you're writing a story in which everything is the same IRL except gravity is minimal to the point where people float like feathers, and you then have a character survive a massive fall that would have otherwise killed a person, it's still internally consistent with the logic that you've set, even if it's not believable by real-life logic. And Spielberg was smart enough to include this line to make it just so. I'm sure they could have found a way around this to make the payoff a little bit more believable, maybe grenades or something, but the point is that they at least put in the legwork to set this up, which is refreshing. And really, that's all I got. It's pretty high tier shit, actually. And that is exactly why this movie deserves to be remembered, not just as a great creature feature, not just as the first summer blockbuster, and not just as a meme, as one of the greatest stories ever committed to screen. Hell, it's really lucky for these kids that the Coast Guard didn't just did I say fucking Coast Guard again?